Good morning, comrades. Jeff today in. It's Tuesday. You know what that means. WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. You also can listen to us on WHIVFM.org/listen. This is your weekly big show of Good Morning, Comrade. We have Jeff in solo just for the moment. I have a very exciting interview coming up with Eric Blanc. Eric is the author of the book Red State Revolt, which is about the teacher strikes from the spring of 2018. We talk about the book. We talk about the future of teacher organizing, the present, and what led up to where we're at now. So, yeah. We also go into the strikes from last spring, this spring rather, the ones that took place in Los Angeles, Oakland, and Denver, and we try to connect the three together. So anyway, here I am, just lucky enough to be dry from the past weekend. We had Hurricane Barry come through. Lucky for the New Orleans area, at least, we didn't get hit too hard by it. I know a couple of people locally got some trees put down, but by and large, the New Orleans area was spared. I know there was some flooding in some of the outlying, outside of the levee zones. Definitely want to provide as much support to those folks as possible, materially and emotionally. So we have been working with DSA New Orleans and some other groups in terms of at least keeping an eye on what the demands and the needs of these folks are and offering a hand where we can help. Definitely want to offer some solidarity to our friends in those outlying areas, Southwest Louisiana. Yeah. I know there was some flooding in like Manchac and down in Plaquemines. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to kick it to our interview with Eric Blanc. Once again, Eric is an organizer. He's also a author. He writes for Jacobin. He did lots of coverage of the strikes in this past spring. So here it is, Eric. Welcome to the show. Good morning, comrade. Eric Blanc. Eric is a writer, author, and a grad student at NYU. Is that correct?
Yeah, NYU.
And you're there for sociology. So, Eric wrote the book Red State Revolt, which covered the teacher strikes from West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona. He's also done coverage of the Los Angeles and Oakland and Denver teacher strikes. So how's it going, Eric?
I'm great. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Welcome to the program. So do you want to just talk a little bit about yourself, and then we can sort of go into the teacher strikes from last year and your reporting on that?
Sure. Yeah. So my background is I grew up in San Francisco. Both of my folks are labor activists, and my mom was a teacher and ended up becoming actually the president of the teachers union. I also became a teacher and have been organizing for a really long time around public education issues. And so when the West Virginia strike popped off last year, I sort of tried to seize the moment and go and try to support as much as possible about writing it. And then also trying to help organize national solidarity for the strikes in West Virginia, then Arizona, Oklahoma, and more recently in some of the strikes in California and Colorado. So yeah, the last year and a half have been pretty enmeshed in this teacher strike wave, and both as an activist and a writer.
Cool. And so you did do a lot of on-the-ground coverage and organizing around the event. Talk about the organizing first. What kind of work did you do with the teachers that were on the ground in all of these places across the country this past 2 years?
Yeah, well, particularly in the red states where the rank and file really was the leadership and initiator of the strike, the space really was there to help organize national solidarity for the teachers, because the major teacher union federations didn't nationally really do that much to build support for the strikes. They kind of have gotten a little bit better since, but at least in 2018 really kind of sat it out. So things like just raising funds to get food for strikers, to get the stories of the strikers out there, to help have a strike fund for teachers who were in need. A lot of that type of infrastructure was lacking. So I was wearing a few different hats, and that was one of the things I tried to help organize. Together with others, people in DSA and people in labor notes, we tried to really give as much support as we could for the strikers on the ground, because we didn't feel like they were getting enough of that from the kind of institutional labor movement.
And how does that, you said it's developed over time. What were some of the developments that were made by these mainstream labor unions?
Well, more recently, NEA in particular, but also the AFT. These are the two big union federations across the country for teachers. They've changed their tack, whereas initially I think they kind of tried to ignore the strikes. Now they nominally are supporting them, and sometimes, in fact, are when they happen. But the major thrust of the unions remains towards, I think, lobbying the Democratic Party and more traditional unionism, rather than doing deep organizing to build towards strikes. So I think that the shift is welcome. It's a good thing that they're, trying to say we need to fight back for more, but it's really insufficient. And there's still a big tension, I think, between the orientation of the leadership of the unions and the necessities of the rank and file.
Yeah, I saw some of this. I might have mentioned this before to you, but over the summer, right at the beginning, there was this big sort of like lobbying push to get these like statewide $1,000 pay raises and $600 for like support, other school workers. And the way that was organized was extremely like be nice to these Democratic politicians, and you fill out your lobbying notes, and maybe if you're lucky, they'll come out and they'll talk to you. One of those sorts of very don't really disrupt what's going on here. You're trying to be nice the whole time situations. So and really it was funny because when we went up there, this was in Baton Rouge, probably about the very beginning of June. Probably, I think it was a week after you came into town, actually. They didn't even organize water for the people who were there. It was just like, oh yeah, you come out, you go get, you just do the thing. It was really kind of interesting how sort of slapdash it was.
Yeah, totally.
So let's get into the strikes from last year. So you talked about the strikes that took place in the spring of 2018. Tell us a little bit about what happened there. Tell us about your reporting and what has sort of gone on during that time and since.
Yeah, so the short version is that in 2018, the big strikes were 3 statewide strikes. First West Virginia, then Oklahoma, then Arizona. Each of them won pretty significant gains, although West Virginia and Arizona were a lot more successful. They won more and were kind of felt on the ground to be more of a big victory. And the initiative for these strikes came from below, as I mentioned before. In none of the places did the union leadership really take the lead. In West Virginia, the people that initiated the walkout were a group of educators who had first gotten politicized through the Bernie Sanders campaign, or at least organized together through the Bernie Sanders campaign, and did a study group in the summer of 2017 on Jane McAlevy's book, No Shortcuts, and they tried to move in the similar direction of deep organizing and strike action. And they eventually succeeded in building enough of a groundswell from below to push the unions to take strike action. They helped organize to continue the strike when the leadership of the union tried to stop it halfway through. And then the strike eventually won and inspired really educators across the country to fight back. Similarly, people saw, well, if they could do it in West Virginia, where strikes are illegal, public sector strikes are illegal, in which there's not collective bargaining, in which unions are relatively weak. Educators in similar contexts like Arizona, like Oklahoma, but then also Colorado, Kentucky, North Carolina, got inspired to do the same. And, that was 2018. And since there's been strikes in Los Angeles, has really been I think the most powerful strike of this whole wave. And then also in Oakland, Denver, and a few other places. So yeah, the strike wave is the biggest strike wave of educators in the history of the United States. In 2018 alone, there was almost 400,000 educators went on strike. And yeah, there's no indication that it's stopping anytime soon.
Cool. And so you mentioned a moment ago that the strikes in West Virginia and Arizona were a bit more successful than the one that took place in Oklahoma. What are some of the reasons that you think that is the case, and what are some of the differences among all three of these mass statewide actions?
So in the book I wrote, Red State Revolt, I ended up writing a book about these strikes, and the structure of the book is really centered on a comparison of these three strikes, West Virginia and Arizona on the one hand, which were very successful, and then Oklahoma, which is less so. And the major lesson that I draw from that is what you had in West Virginia and in Arizona was what I call, and what others have called, a militant minority, which is to say that amongst the rank and file, there was a core group of radicals with experience who knew how to organize. And it was really these folks, a lot of whom were socialists, not all, but were definitely part of the core. They were able to seize the moment and lead the rank and file and eventually the kind of movement as a whole in the direction of deep organizing and pushing towards strike action, and doing the workplace organizing, that is necessary, and that social media can help sort of spread the word, but it's not a substitute for actually building organizations at the school sites and statewide. And in Oklahoma, there wasn't an equivalent layer that led the rank and file. The folks who stepped up to lead the rank and file groups were very inexperienced. They didn't build any organization on the ground. They really limited themselves to just social media agitation. And so the strength of the strike was a lot lower than in any of the other places, in part because just the type of workplace organizing, the type of infrastructure that had been built in the other states was lacking, in part because of the inexperience of the leaders of the rank and file in Oklahoma. And I think that ended up playing a big role in the divergence between the outcomes.
And yeah, the one of the other things too, from what I gathered and from what I was reading, the Oklahoma's, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it seemed that Oklahoma's union leadership was almost like they wanted to be in front of the rank and file in terms of how that action went. They didn't want to essentially have the rank and file take over, and they sort of maintained a very top control of the way that the strikes went. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's generally true. That's also true in West Virginia, though. So it wasn't specific to Oklahoma. I mean, I think really in most places the unions leaderships wanted to maintain control, but in West Virginia they tried and got out organized right when they called off the strike, and the rank and file went wildcat. So they tried doing that. Similarly in Arizona, I think the leadership wanted to assert itself more, but the rank and file was so well organized that just the union leadership sort of was obliged to, defer to a certain extent to the organized rank and file. In Oklahoma, there was more space for the leadership to assert itself as the driving force at a certain point, because the rank and file group lost the initiative insofar as they just kind of called the walkout and then didn't do the organizing necessary to make it happen.
Right. Now, you mentioned that in West Virginia, that was one of the key distinctions that made that action unique as well, when they went wildcat. What does going wildcat mean, and how did that affect? How was that sort of developed amongst the school workers in West Virginia, and was it successful?
Yes, a wildcat strike is when workers strike without the authorization of the union or the union leadership. So that's what happened in West Virginia halfway through, after the union leadership tried to end the strike and the workers continued it. And what was the second part of the question?
So how did that develop through, specifically in West Virginia, and was it successful?
Yeah,
what were some of the effects of it?
Right. Yes. So it ended up saving the strike. I mean, what ended up happening is the leadership tried to call off the strike because they had reached what they saw as a gentleman's agreement with the governor, but the ranks didn't want to end the strike, not just because their demands weren't met, but also because even this so-called agreement hadn't actually been signed. It was just a, behind closed doors type agreement. And as it turns out, that saved the strike because despite this gentleman's agreement, the Senate in West Virginia, which was had a somewhat distinct and even more reactionary orientation than the Republican governor, ended up rejecting this gentleman's agreement from the right. And so had the workers gone back at that time, it's very likely the strike would have lost. So, the rank and file really saved the strike by sensing that they had to stick it out until victory. And and that's ended up being what happened. They ended up winning a 5% raise for all public employees. They defeated the attempt to drastically raise their healthcare costs for PEIA, which is the public insurance for all state employees. And, they really, I think, won a moral victory by beating back these, reactionary Republicans and showing working people across the country that, you could fight back and win, and you didn't have to just accept whatever the politicians threw at you.
Gentlemen's agreements, probably the perfect word for that, because it was something that was made by essentially just by the leadership, and it to the exclusion of the membership. It didn't even essentially, I understand the idea that union leadership should have the ability to negotiate, but that has to be up to a review of membership. And so essentially that was a really great opportunity for the workers to show their power in this situation, without even approval of the leadership. So I thought that was something that was one of the most really important parts of that entire strike, and it showed the power of an organized rank and file. In general, it was really cool.
Yeah, agreed.
I remember I was watching when this happened, and I was talking about it with my para, and I was just as I explained this to her, because she wasn't following the story, she was just dropped her jaw. It's amazing what the power of an organized rank and file is capable of.
Yeah. I mean, the question of union democracy was posed very strongly. People felt strongly that they had voted to go out on strike, and they wanted to have a say on when they ended it. They didn't want to just be dictated to, whether it was from the state or from their own union leadership.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting question. Before I move on, I want to talk a little bit more about Arizona. But before we do that, the question of union democracy is a really important one, and I see that there is a lot of situations where members of a union or workers in general will decide to not be a member of that union because of they don't. I guess they don't feel that they have ownership in it. They don't feel that they're a part of that as an organization. Can you talk a little bit about the third partyization of labor unions and how that is detrimental to the building of worker power? It's actually a disorganizing factor, I find, in a lot of situations.
Yeah, well, the reality is that for decades now, most unions have focused their efforts on just lobbying the Democratic Party, and so they don't need a mobilized or organized membership, because you really just need people's dues money for that, and then you can use that to buy some lobbyists and maybe a couple advertisements somewhere. So it's in that context, it's really understandable that a lot of union members, probably most union members at most times, and teachers unions like other unions, are checked out, and they don't really see what exactly the union is doing for them most of the time, and that that has a negative consequence, because people oftentimes will then just see the union as distant to them, and as you said, a third party. And one of the things that the rank and file organizers had to do in each one of these states was to combat that and say, look, we are the union. The union isn't just the a small group of elected officials or staff, but it's all of us, and it's only going to be as good or as strong as we make it. So it's understandable you have this criticism of the union, but if you don't come to the meeting, if you don't start organizing your workplace, that's not going to change. And so I think that this idea that we are the union was extremely powerful for bringing people back in, giving them ownership, and in that process, combating some of the limited strategic orientation of the existing leadership.
Yeah. And so the leadership, I really, this is something that I sometimes struggle to communicate in my day-to-day organizing, but I think it's a really important question. What are are the objectives of rank and file membership of unions, or just general like regular workers, whether or not they're a member of the unions, and the essentially the objectives and material like values of union leadership, are they the same, or are they different, or is it kind of it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that?
I mean, it's tricky. I think the best way to look at it is that the union leadership, because of its structural position, tends to be subjected to a lot of pressures to accommodate itself with management rather than fight management, more so than the rank and file. So, they're
along to get along.
Yeah, they're the people that have to meet with the management. They get wined and dined. They also tend to, by their own function, they're not in the work sites. So there's a tendency for the full-time officials to get a little bit distant from the concerns and dynamics of the rank and file, and they can sometimes develop their own their own distinct way of looking at things and their own distinct interests. It might be in their interests to not rock the boat as much, and so I definitely think that there's a pressure and a tendency for, leaders of any large organization, but, particularly unions or political parties, to develop somewhat more conservative tendencies. That being said, it's not always the case that that's true. We've seen plenty of radical leaderships take over unions and transform them towards bodies fighting for the rank and file and for militant strike action. But even in those cases, these radicals then are in turn subjected to similar pressures, and so it takes a lot of ideological clarity, and then as well as rank and file organization to prevent even these new leaders from starting to bend towards management.
Right. Yeah, that's really, and we can talk a little bit about Chicago in a minute. I did want to go back to Arizona. You mentioned in your book that there was some of the most difficult organizing that took place in all of the teacher strikes took place in Arizona. because they're very strong and very aggressive immigration policies, and there's also multiple different sort of identities that were involved. Can you talk a little bit about the organizing that took place in Arizona and what were some of the challenges and successes that took place to create to create that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I argue, and I think it's true that the Arizona strike in some ways was the most remarkable strike we've seen yet because it took place in such a difficult context, and nevertheless it won and ended up being so successful. So the reality is Arizona is this state that is just on firm lockdown by the privatizers, people like the Koch brothers and Alec, these really reactionary dark money forces, have bought just the vast majority of the Republican Party. And so the educators in Arizona were subjected to a much deeper kind of red baiting campaign, deeper offensive from above. And they had to, in that process, develop a very, very deep organization to overcome, not just these attacks, but also the history of racial divisions brought about by the deep anti-immigrant xenophobic campaigns that the Republican Party has led in these states. So they were able to do that. It was a multiracial movement. They really brought together a lot of white teachers and Mexican American teachers together with an overwhelmingly non-white student body. So yeah, I think it was a really amazing achievement what they were able to pull off in such difficult conditions.
Yeah, it really was, and you mentioned that they may have been the most successful of the three, or I mean, it's really hard to distinguish, which is more than the others. But would you say that they were able to sort of, in terms of concessions from leadership or from school board, were they able to get probably more than the others?
Well, I mean, in terms of if you take what they won as far as pay as the proxy, then yeah, they won a 20% pay raise, and that was certainly more than in the other states. I think their big achievement though was they also just built the deepest organization, so they were most successful in their ability to kind of build a movement, and in that process win concessions. So the reality though is in all of these states, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, the strikes didn't win everything, and the schools really remain far below what teachers want them to be. So it's not the case that all of a sudden because of the strikes the schools have been magically transformed, but they won important gains, and I think gave people a sense of confidence to fight back.
So let's fast forward a little bit and change gears. But before we do that, you're listening to WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3, WHIV FM. You are listening to Good Morning Comrade. Our guest this morning is Eric Blanc. He is the author of Red State Revolt, about the teacher strikes that took place in West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona. So let's fast forward to this past year, 2019. There was teacher action once again this spring, most notably in Los Angeles. Can you talk a little bit about what happened in Los Angeles? What were the things that led up to the strikes in Los Angeles, and what has come after? What were some of the after effects?
Yeah, so the LA strike was very important for a few different reasons. The first is that it punctured this myth that the strikes were only a thing in red states. Presumably only the Republicans did bad things to public schools, but in fact, the Democratic Party has been just as responsible, and sometimes actually a lot worse when it comes to privatization, austerity, and just the push against public schools in general. So LA's strike showed this because they had to go up against not Republicans but liberal Democrats and the Democratic Party establishment. The second big reason it was so important was that it was the deepest organizing anywhere we've seen because unlike in the red states, the union in LA was led by people who wanted to orient towards building, worker power, built towards a strike. And so they used their resources, and the staff and the leadership of the union was all oriented towards just doing a massive buildup over 4 years. The radicals won the 2014 elections, took over the union, and spent just a huge amount of time and strategic discussion to get their union completely overhauled to build it into a fighting machine based on rank and file empowerment. So yeah, I think it was pretty remarkable what they were able to do. And they shut down LA really, and they went further than any other city or state in the types of gains that they won. Because not just on better pay or lower class sizes, although those were crucial. They also won demands like an end to racial profiling in the schools of Black and Muslim students, more rights for immigrant families in the school district, things like this that I think kind of help point the way, hopefully, for educators across the country.
Yeah, and like you mentioned the rank and file movement, that started essentially in Chicago in the 2010s with the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think the 2012 teacher strike in Chicago was in many ways the first opening shot in what is now the Red for Ed movement. Really, a lot of the people that organized the West Virginia strike and in Arizona, they had as their precedent what they had seen in Chicago in 2012. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the Chicago example was extremely important for at least the core group of organizers that initiated a lot of these walkouts. It didn't have the same, it didn't spread nationally in the same way as West Virginia did, but I think it did play an important precursor role.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really something that I find that's super important, and that's something that we also need to I see a very direct line from Chicago to these, even these red state strikes, and then straight to these more urban strikes of Denver and Los Angeles and Oakland. So I guess as we sort of wind it down a bit, I was looking through the Bernie Sanders Thurgood Marshall education plan, and I got to tell you, I'm very impressed with that. You're involved with the Educators for Bernie, or for in terms of building a movement. Building sort of a support for Bernie Sanders within these teachers unions. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why Bernie Sanders would be good for educators as the president of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, strikes are crucial, and then they've done so much to kind of turn things around for educators over the last year and a half, but they're not enough. In order to really systematically win the schools that our students need, that requires political power, and it's going to require, really radically changing the priorities of our government. So, the Bernie Sanders campaign is so crucial, not only because it can inspire more educators to fight back in the same way that it did, in 2015, 2016, by inspiring some of the key teacher activists in West Virginia and Arizona, but it can change the political discussion nationally. And I think that Bernie's Thurgood Marshall plan has done that, for instance, by raising the call for a moratorium on charter schools, which is just so urgent at this point. And I think that Bernie's plan is by far, there's not anyone even close, the best when it comes to reflecting and furthering the demands of educators. So, it's unfortunate that the leaderships of the two major teacher unions in the country seem to be more scared of Bernie than they are of losing the election again. And so instead of letting the membership vote on who they want their unions to endorse for president in 2020, the leaderships again are just, sort of at this time pretending to have a democratic process, but at most it's just a kind of consultation, but without a democratic vote on who the unions should endorse.
I watched, they had a forum, the NEA put on a forum about 2 weeks ago with several of the presidential candidates, and they came forward. And the only one that talked about a very clear plan, because he's the only one that has a very clear plan, is Bernie Sanders. And the one of the things that I've found personally, like in my own organizing, is that when I'm like, he's the only person that is the only plan that I can actually give to someone, like someone who might not normally be engaged in this kind of not this kind of thing, and I can say, hey, this is why you should support this plan. This is the only thing you can actually give to just a regular person that they can sink their teeth into.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the case, and so I'm hoping that the Bernie campaign will continue to inspire educators, but vice versa, that educators continue to organize and support Bernie.
Mm-hmm. One last question before we break here. I want to talk a little bit about the durability of this movement. We've seen in West Virginia since the teacher strikes, there have been attacks on once again the insurance program that the public employees in West Virginia initially went in strike over, the PEIA. Also, we've seen introductions of charter schools into West Virginia specifically. So it's a very clear sort of punitive campaign that's being engaged with by the leadership, by essentially the right wing, and a lot of times it's coalition with Democrats and Republicans, but the reform movement essentially. So what do you think about the durability of this movement going forward? Are these things sustainable at this level, like these statewide or very large citywide strikes? And what is the future of the movement of essentially the anti-school reform, pro school, like school worker movement?
Yeah, that's a big question. The reality is that the strikes have been a game changer in terms of building up power and confidence, but it's not so easy to sustain that level of mobilization all the time. It's in fact impossible. You can't just be on strike all of the time. And so then how you continue to build power after the strike is quite difficult, because people are exhausted, people need to get back to work, and the capitalists and their politicians, they just have so much more in the way of resources that once we get demobilized at all, they're immediately able to seize the moment to try to reverse things. And so there's not, in any of these states, any just a moment of peace. Almost immediately, the right wing has tried to retake the initiative. And so you mentioned in some of these states, some of the punitive measures, and all of these things are real. In some of the cases, they were defeated. West Virginia defeated a lot of the worst of them, although they didn't defeat all of them. As you mentioned, charters have been introduced. And I think then the answer has to be that the only way we're going to be able to build a lasting movement is not just with strikes, although strikes are an essential part of it, but we need to really systematically win back and transform our unions, because the unions have the resources to continue the fight on the day-to-day in a way that is hard for a more disorganized rank and file. So I think the LA model is really the one that we should be looking for, where radicals are able to win over democratically the leadership of their unions and then use that union to continue to build power after the strike. So in LA, they're pivoting towards an initiative to tax the rich on a statewide level. And I think that it's going to be, efforts like that are going to be able to sustain the movement in between the strikes that are necessary, but that, you can't do every day. So I do think that it's a challenge. There's no quick fix, but I think at this moment, the momentum is still with the educators. We're winning the public argument. The strikes are continuing. And despite, some setbacks, I think the momentum is still on our side.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It looks like the idea that even rhetorically a lot of these politicians have to at least pay service to respected teachers is a vast improvement over what had happened probably 10 years ago, when the teachers were viewed as the problem in the education reformers framing. So I think that we're heading in the right direction. So thanks a lot for coming on. Good morning, comrade Eric. Appreciate it. Hope to see you soon, and you're always welcome to come back. If you're ever here, you can just drop in the studio and we can do it again.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks again to Eric Blanc for coming on to the program. Really do appreciate it. You should go out and pick up his book. The book is called Red State Revolt. It's put out by Verso Books. Definitely give that a look and follow Eric's reporting all the time. It's really great. He's done some of the best on the ground coverage of the teacher strikes. He was in Jacobin. I believe he was in The Guardian and also in The Nation. So keep an eye on Eric. Follow him on Twitter. Follow him on all the social media. So yeah, let's change gears really quickly for the last couple minutes of the show. I just want to talk about how Hurricane Barry, the way people talk about the way the storm hit, and how that affected the ice raids over the weekend. So there's a lot of reporting coming out that says that Louisiana especially New Orleans, was sort of spared in the large dragnet rounding up of undocumented immigrants, which is basically just a formalized terrorization of people without status in the country. And it's important that we don't give any slack to these kinds of groups. Lights for Liberty, which is a coalition event that's happening this Saturday. Well, it was initially supposed to happen this past Friday the 12th. Unfortunately, we had to postpone it because of Hurricane Barry, but we pushed it back to make sure that people who go out to it will be safe. It's rescheduled for July 19th. That's this Friday. So if you can make it out, that would be great. You're probably hearing a lot about that on the rest on this channel. I know Martha and Mark Allen and Kenny have been talking about this as well. And we can't. It's something that we need to come together and show solidarity for the folks that are in this, that are being terrorized by ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. And I just want to talk a little bit about quickly for that event, and then a little bit more big picture going forward. So for Lights for Liberty, which again is going to take place this Friday, the message is going to be specifically about the abolition and defunding ICE. So we want to make sure that when we go out there, because if we talk about how the conditions in the camps are awful, which they are, these people are being denied soap. These people are being denied, deodorant and toothpaste and all these basic life essentials, and that's awful and it's terrible. If we make that argument, and we have, Democrats have already proven that they're willing to make concessions on those grounds. So what I mean by that is, if our argument is, well, we need to get these people soap, and we need to get these people, deodorant and toothbrushes and toothpaste and all that other stuff, which they absolutely do definitely need, 100%. If that's the argument that we're making, those are the solutions that will be provided. By that I mean, the people that are being detained illegally or not even illegally, like wrongly, being terrorized by the state, by the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration Customs Enforcement, etc., Customs Border Patrol, etc. The people that are being terrorized are going to get those things and nothing more. So, give an example. About 2 weeks ago now, the House Democrats, led by Nancy Pelosi, made a large concession to the logic of even having these people in these camps at all. They gave, I believe it was $4 billion to the Department of Homeland Security funding to continue this program, to continue rounding up people without immigration status who are fleeing very dangerous conditions in their home countries, in El Salvador and Honduras, conditions that the United States created by their project of essentially attacking these pink-tide governments that popped up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it's important that the argument that we're making is to eliminate the program entirely. By that I mean we want to eliminate the wholesale rounding up of people who are seeking asylum and essentially refugees from violence and economic destruction created by the United States. And so the message that we want to send is abolish these organizations, abolish this program, defund all of this entire apparatus. So defund ICE, abolish ICE, close the camps. We shouldn't have these camps. We shouldn't have concentration camps. Not just in the United States, anywhere. But we are in the United States. We have nominal, at least rhetorical influence over these things. And if we're out united with this message, as opposed to get them soap, that's a much stronger demand. And that is going to engage with the problem right where it's at. So keep an eye out also in Louisiana, specifically New Orleans area. The Southern Poverty Law Center has been a part of a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit, filed by the people who are detained in these camps and their families, because in New Orleans, New Orleans is not paroling the detainees that are in the camps. New Orleans and Louisiana, we are the worst. We have the highest rates of detention, whereas in many of those places, they're being paroled out once they sort of register and they talk about, oh, they have a family here or whatever, and they have a lot of sort of check-ins that they would have to do with the department, which is also, by the way, they shouldn't have to do that. It's extremely onerous burden to put on people who are literally seeking asylum. However, in New Orleans and the greater New Orleans area and the state of Louisiana, we're holding detainees without any kind of trial, without anything. We're just detaining them. Period. We're holding them. And there's a lawsuit that's been filed by some of these detainees saying that this has to stop. So, again, our objective and our goal is to abolish these programs and to abolish these camps and to abolish ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. Department of Homeland Security. Those things need to be eliminated. However, this is something that's meeting more at the point of attack. So and it's specific to the local area as well. So make sure that you're keeping an eye on that specifically. If you can come out, definitely show up to Lights for Liberty. It's going to be at the ICE Immigration Office, 1250 Poydras Street, Suite 325. It's going to be from 7 to 9. It's going to be a pretty big deal. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it on the initial night, but definitely show up. Definitely keep an eye out on ways to support. Congress of Day Laborers has been absolutely essential in this entire project. They actually have a message. So this is from the Congress of Day Laborers. It says, and so you're aware, Congress of Day Laborers is a membership organization that focuses on people who are migrants to the city who are working, and they have entire programs of mutual support in place. They're absolutely amazing. They're and I'll talk about it here on the I'm going to read from the Post, but from the Congress of Day Laborers, hit translate if you're not an English speaker. While most of Louisiana's residents return to their daily lives after Hurricane Barry, ICE is trying to inflict another disaster. There is no clear information about what will happen in Louisiana. But last week, 2 officers from the Department of Internal Security claimed that nationally, ICE has prepared a list of 2,000 goals with deportation orders that will also be collateral arrests. Your goal is to land us, but our community is organized. We will defend our rights, we will record ICE's dirty tactics, and we will move trained allies to alert and prevent these disasters in our neighborhoods. This Friday from 7 to 9, there will be a vigil of hundreds of people in front of the ICE office in New Orleans, Lights for Liberty, New Orleans, Louisiana, to demand an end to raids and federal investment in ICE instead have true public security. For support in case of an emergency with ICE or police, call the emergency line of the Congress of Day Laborers, 504-655-9815. And just to add on to that as we close, the Congress of Day Laborers have been putting together a program to have essentially allies throughout the community. Keep an eye on ICE. Eyes of Congreso is the program's name, Ojos de Congreso. And the entire objective of it is to have people who are not threatened, at least not currently, have them monitor and film ICE when they're doing the things that they're doing and showing it. Essentially, it's a mutual aid situation where we keep watch on ICE. It's ICE watch. And they've also had situations where we would have some of our folks escort some of their members to their ICE or immigration hearings. So if you want to be a part of that, definitely check them out. If you need a little, if you want to contact us, we'll definitely get you in contact with Congreso. Contact at goodmorningcomrade.com. You can also, so that's going to be it for this week. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, all the stuff. Make sure that we're watching out for one another and that we can show solidarity in the while these things are happening. So yeah, Facebook, Twitter, at Comrade Morning on Twitter, facebook.com/goodmorningcomrade, Instagram, Good Morning Comrade. Yeah, check us out. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, all the stuff. And see you next time. Love you.